let's go ahead and get started. We want to thank you all for joining ITIF this morning for the presentation of a very interesting report from Standard Chartered Bank called Technology, Reshaping the Global Economy. I think we're going to have a great discussion today. I'll start with a few remarks before handing it over to our panelists. I'd also like to admit that, to mention that ITIF has several interesting events coming up in future weeks. First, on Thursday, March 12th, an event on Crypto Wars 2.0, how should the United States balance privacy and national security. On Tuesday, March 31st, an event with Marilee Mancuso on the innovative state, how governments should make markets, not just fix them. And finally, on Wednesday, April 1st, how techno-populism is impeding healthy tech policy debates. So that's upcoming from ITIF. So back in January, my colleague, ITIF President Rob Atkinson, and I traveled to New Delhi, India, to release this report, The Indian Economy at a Crossroads. And one of the key points that report tried to make was to say, if India wants to achieve robust economic growth and deal with the looming demographic dividend of 100 million people entering its workforce in the next decade, that would have to increase productivity growth. In fact, in 1970, Indian levels of productivity growth were essentially 2/3 higher than China's. Today, China's productivity growth is 2/3 greater than India's. So we made that point at a dinner with some CEOs, and the CEO of Hero, which is a moped company in India, said, you know, Rob and Steve, you just don't understand. India can't afford the productivity growth because we need the jobs. And of course, that gets it wrong entirely. If you had greater productivity growth, you'd have more jobs. And what I really like about John's report is that it tackles so many of these important public policy issues head on. It deals seriously with important questions about how automation and productivity will impact technology growth and income inequality in developed and developing countries alike. It makes very important points for policymakers in developed and developing nations alike about how they should adopt to changing patterns of economic growth and global trade and reposition their role in global value chains. In short, I think it's a very important report, and we're fortunate to have John with us today. So with that, let me introduce John and the rest of the panelists, and then I'll go before you, John. So first then, John Calverley is Head of Economics Research at Standard Chartered Global Research, where he provides analysis of key global themes and markets. John has written several books, including When Bubbles Burst, Surviving the Financial Fallout. He previously served as Chief Economist and Strategist at American Express Bank in London, and he's a graduate of Cambridge University and Washington University in St. Louis. After John, we'll hear from Chris Veen, who currently serves as a principal at Dome Advisory Services, as the Chief Innovation Advisor to the Securities Industry Research Center of the Asia Pacific, and as founding chair of the Knowledge Economy Institute. Chris previously served as the CIO for Global Information and Communications Technology Development at the World Bank, and as the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Following Chris, we'll hear from Dr. Rodney Ludema, who is the Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of State. He is currently taking a leave of absence from Georgetown University, where he teaches at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. He previously served as a senior international economist at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Executive Office of the President. He has a BA in economics from Calvin College and a PhD from Columbia. Finally, we'll hear from Pilar Fernandez, who serves as Minister Counselor at the Embassy of Colombia, where she focuses primarily on economic, energy, and education affairs. She previously served as economic advisor to the CEO of the Colombian Coffee Growers Federation. Pilar holds a bachelor's as well as a master's from the University of Los Andes in Bogota and an MBA from Georgetown University. So with that, John, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for that kind introduction, and thanks so much for hosting this event, this excellent venue. Thanks all for coming, and especially to my respondents for hopefully giving some interesting comments on our paper. So Standard Chartered, for those of you who don't know, we're an emerging markets bank based in the UK, particularly focused on Asia, Middle East and Africa. So the focus of our report really was to try to understand how technology is changing, particularly emerging market development options. But we also look at issues like inequality, like the type of policies that developed countries should apply as well. So if we could get the slides up, yeah. What we were trying to do really was the first part looks at the new technologies that are coming and how they might affect things. Then we look at the impact on developed markets, and then we look at the impact on emerging markets. Some technical problems.
Yeah, John, maybe in the future your report can explain how to make Skype work properly and fix PowerPoint.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, good, we're up and running. So I think most people here will be familiar with the idea that digital technology is a general purpose technology. It's changing everything, and it has to be compared with previous technologies like bronze, like the mass production, like the internal combustion engine. The first wave was, of course, the mainframe computer, which came in and changed things in the 60s and 70s. Imagine my industry, the financial industry, before computers. It was all on paper. The second wave was the personal computer and the internet, which basically started in the early 1990s. And the third wave is the technologies we're really talking about now. On the right there, you see a list of some of the ones that we particularly focus on. So mobile, which has been obviously going for some years now, but really we're still exploring the possibilities there. And in emerging markets, it's only just getting underway. Just in the last couple of years, people have been able to get smartphones at relatively low prices. The speeds are improving gradually, broadband's spreading gradually. But it's still quite new in emerging markets, especially outside the city. The cloud is obviously already quite established, but there's big hopes for that. Big data, the Internet of Things, 3D printing, etc., etc., robots, drones, driverless cars. So this is, I would say, the third wave of the digital revolution, which is coming through. It's really being driven by three things, three C's as we call them. Computing power. So Moore's law, the idea that computing power doubles about 18 months to 2 years, is still intact so far. And that's very powerful. That means that every 5 to 7 years, computing power goes up by a factor of 10. So the chip in your phone today, in 5 years' time, that will be close to 10 times more powerful. Connectivity, of course, the internet, now mobile, but also RFID and other technologies which are linking things together, very, very important. And then the zero copying cost. Now, previous general purpose technologies also substantially lowered costs. If you think of the effect of railways on lowering the cost of travel and transport. But with digital, it actually goes all the way to zero, effectively, to copy something. And that, I think, has economic implications which go beyond the effect of other general purpose technologies. This is hard. So, general purpose technologies change everything. I think you're familiar with this idea. It's not just new products and new services, it's also how and where work is organized. It's the nature of work and leisure. It's disruptive to business as well. And one of the things that struck us, one of the reasons we wrote this report, was we kept hearing how business people, despite all the troubles in the world, were saying that their number one focus was technology and how it might change their business. Whether one of the big technology companies could take their business or some startup from nowhere. So huge impact there. This is an attempt by McKinsey to put some kind of value on the new technologies to try to indicate what they might be worth. And I should say McKinsey will be the first to say this is very tentative, this is very speculative. But what they tried to do was to add up the effects of potential known impacts of these technology in different sectors of the economy. They've left a lot out, and of course the estimates are just estimates. But I think there's a couple of interesting things to notice. The first 5 or 6 there are all digital, so mobile internet, automation of knowledge, which is artificial intelligence and other things, cloud, the Internet of Things, robotics, autonomous vehicles. these are all digital things, and notice how much larger than they are than some of the ones at the tail there, like renewable energy, advanced materials. And there's a lot of exciting stuff going on there too, but the digital is way more important. And the second thing I would point out, looking at this, which struck me particularly, was the automation of knowledge is one of the most important ones here. So that's very interesting, I think. Notice that it says the impact including consumer surplus. And one of the issues here, I think, is that when we look at GDP, we're often not capturing the effect of new digital technologies or new general purpose technologies. GDP just doesn't calculate it very well. So there's the concept of consumer surplus, which is the idea that, for example, when you buy a car, you wouldn't be buying it unless it gave you at least the value it cost you. But of course, it's actually giving you a lot more than that. There's a consumer surplus. It's worth more than what you pay in most cases. And so they're trying to calculate that as well to get the full impact. But one of the issues as we go through, and particularly thinking about productivity, is whether we are really measuring the impact. If you think of Facebook, it's changed a lot of people's lives. The impact on GDP is really quite small. The value of that company, the advertising, the use of digital data, it doesn't show up very large in GDP, and yet it's a huge product for many, many people. That's a good slide. Oh, no, skip one. No, that's okay. Oh, no, we did skip one. So robots is one of the things we look at particularly, and I looked at that because it seemed to be one that might particularly impact on emerging markets. If you think of what emerging markets are trying to do these days, it's very much trying to plug into the global supply chain and use the comparative advantage of cheap labor. But if robots can do things cheaply, efficiently, 24 hours a day, without needing rests, without going on strike, this could be very powerful. So we looked at this, and robotics has been around for a very long time. It's something that companies have been trying to do, and it's clear that it's just beginning to take off. Companies have learned how to make robots that learn. You haven't got to pre-program every single thing. The robots themselves can actually learn as they go along, and that is really beginning to change things. So these are some of the things we look at for the potential for it, and I think we're going to see more and more of this as we go through the next few years. So innovation is likely accelerating. Not these slides, they're going rather slowly, but the innovation we think is accelerating, and that's partly digital technology itself, which I think aids research and development, the ability to share information. Obviously we've got the internet, but we're moving towards, as we see in this meeting, we're using Skype, using video conferencing, telepresence, virtual reality techniques, all these things, but also 3D printing. They enable people to share much more effectively. And then better organization. The US has done this kind of university, business, government linkage relatively well for a long time. A lot of other countries haven't, but they've learned how to do it, and that's changing things. And then more researchers. Around the world, companies are adding to the number of researchers they have. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. So this is the number of researchers per million people. You can see some of the Asian countries in particular expanding dramatically. Notice Korea there. But every country here is adding to the number of researchers. And China isn't on here, but actually China is adding massively as well. So we think there's going to be more innovation, more development of the basic technologies that we have. So various questions then immediately arise looking at this as an economist. First of all, we hear all this about technology. It's all supposed to be changing the world. The robots are all going to take our jobs. But where's the productivity growth? Actually, productivity growth in the US, in Europe, and in emerging markets as well has been very disappointing in recent years. So what's going on? What's happening there? What does it mean for economic growth? Is this something that could help solve the supposed problem of secular stagnation? So I'll look at that. Inequality. We did a big report on inequality last year, and we followed up looking at it again in this report. I think technology is one of the main reasons for the expansion of inequality within countries, so we look at that. And then particularly, what does it mean for emerging markets? Should we see it as a threat or as an opportunity? So here's a look at productivity in the US. And as you know, the story is productivity growth was very rapid in the middle part of the 20th century. And that was really the previous general purpose technologies, the internal combustion engine, the airplane, electricity, all those things working through with high rate of investment and spreading throughout the population. Then it collapsed. And we saw a bit of a blip in upwards in productivity growth at the end of the 20th century, which I think was associated with the internet and the personal computer arriving on everybody's desks in the office. We also know that it particularly affected supply chains and inventory control, very important there. But since then, productivity growth has slowed again. And if we look at it, the next slide shows the total factor productivity. Again, that big blue block, the right-hand side, you can see total factor productivity. So trying to look at what happens to productivity after you take out the improvement in the labour force, also very weak after that rise. So our view is that these new technologies should improve productivity growth over the next 5, 10, 15 years. I can't prove that, and as you know, there's skepticism. Robert Gordon is the famous skeptic on this, although even he would argue that we can go up from the 0.6 because of the new technologies. Just don't expect anything really radical, he would say. But if you spend time in Silicon Valley, you'll definitely come back with a much rosier view. One of the points that we emphasize throughout the report is that for countries, it's not about developing your own Silicon Valley. It's actually about using the technology that comes out. It's about adoption of the technology, and that's by far the most important thing. So if we go to the next slide. I'm not sure why my technology is not working. There we go. So I showed you the US productivity. What's interesting is how other countries are lagging. And I think you can see here how the European countries, and also looking at Singapore and Japan, were catching up very well until about 1995. Catching up with the US, this is. And then it seems they fell behind. It wasn't so much that those countries did badly, it was just that the US did very well for a period. And what seems to have happened is that European countries and Japan were not very good at actually adopting the new technologies that the US did. And there's still no sign of that improving. And if you look carefully, you can see countries like Italy and Spain particularly falling back there. So this seems to be a real problem. It's all about adoption. We can get to the next slide. Yep. One of the things we look at is the World Economic Forum's Network Readiness Index, which covers a whole range of data points. And you can see that even with this wide dispersion of income per capita, a lot of countries at a fairly high level. Asia always does pretty well on these things. You can see Taiwan and Korea there. But you can notice that Italy, Spain, France, lagging there. And this, I think, is certainly one of the biggest problems in Europe. The euro itself may be a problem. We can argue about that. But I think it's the slow growth in Europe, which in those countries was evident even before 2008. And I think this is one of the reasons why. We can get to the next slide. Oh, this one. Trying to go back now. There we go. So I wanted to address this issue of whether investment could pick up, because one of the reasons I think that both growth and productivity growth has been slow since the crisis is that investment is relatively low. But it's actually been coming down everywhere, really over the last 20 years. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is various problems in the world and the lack of animal spirits. There's another reason, though, which is that digital technology itself is relatively inexpensive. And as we shift towards a more services type society, basically what you need is a computer, which is very inexpensive. Computer and then the service, and they're all coming down in price. So China, of course, is investing very heavily in big things, in manufacturing and in infrastructure and other emerging markets. But especially in the developed countries, there's a tendency for it to come down. So this is, I think, a little bit ambiguous. I think we will see more and more investment as companies try to avoid being disrupted. They try to get ahead of the curve. Certainly in the financial industry, mobile is becoming almost the standard for retail banking now in many countries. And so we've got a huge investment to do to keep up with that and have the kind of interface people want to see. But as I say, it doesn't cost all that much money. So I think we will see more investment, but whether it'll translate to big amounts in dollars is harder to say. Let me go on to the next slide. I want to talk about, sorry, twice I think. Okay, this one we want. So inequality, and I think one of the issues for the developed countries in particular is the problem that the effects of so-called skills bias technical change. That if you have access to the computers, you can actually be extremely effective. People who don't have that, people with lower skills, they're not much more effective than before. Maybe a bit more with the help of the mobile, but not as effective as you can be with all the resources that the computer and the internet supplies. So let's go to this. So I want to talk about the challenges and opportunities for developed countries, and then I'll come to emerging countries. So one of the issues with adoption, I think, is just the whole structure of economies. The labour laws, for example, if you think of how restrictive the labour laws are in a place like France or Italy, how difficult it is then for a company to really restructure, to really bring in the new technology quickly. It means you've got to lay people off, it means you've got to deal with the unions. So they're under pressure, of course, from rivals, but nevertheless, these kinds of restrictions mean that really changing the way you work is not necessarily at the front edge of what executives are trying to do. Education, I think, is a key issue. Are people really ready for the digital age? The good news is that digital technology itself makes education easier, and that's very important for emerging countries. But nevertheless, if your iPhone can correct your grammar, correct your spelling, do all your calculations for you, maybe the old reading, writing, and arithmetic is not so important. Maybe what's more important is the things that the machines can't do so well, which is the interacting with people, like the selling part. They can't deal so well with the sort of positional realities. So that maybe those things are what we've got to emphasize more. So this is something I think to think about. And distribution of income, as I've said, we may start to see things actually continuing to widen. There's one caveat to that, though, which is artificial intelligence and the extent to which you can increasingly middle-skilled people will be able to use these artificial intelligence systems to do things. If you think of a nurse working with that kind of system, could actually be more effective. And cheaper, of course, than using a doctor. And there's quite a lot of evidence, and you may know this from a personal experience, that doctors often struggle to diagnose effectively, and actually many of the artificial intelligence systems arguably are better, because they can bring in all the new information, all this research studies, they can search across data and see what's happened with other people, so arguably those are going to be better. Opportunities, I've talked about these, so the faster productivity growth, I think that's very likely. Exactly how fast, who knows. Higher investment, although whether that's going to be at a sort of macroeconomic scale that really drives the economy in terms of dollar spend is, I think, less certain. And I think helping to avoid the secular stagnation through the productivity growth, really. So if we can go on. So turning to emerging markets, and I think part of the story here is definitely that emerging markets are adopting the new technologies relatively quickly. And that's partly because, well, there's a number of reasons. Partly some of these things are cheaper. Private vehicles, obviously expensive compared to a smartphone. You can get smartphones now in China for $50 or less, and they're maybe not quite as effective as your latest iPhone 6, but they're pretty efficient machines. Whereas mobile phones, much cheaper thing, and then internet use again. So they're spreading through countries relatively faster. Although I would caution that they still haven't got all that far. There's still a lot more to come. The speeds in many emerging markets, the reliability, and also the spread is still limited, and that I think is a very positive factor in that there's a lot of potential still to come in that respect. So what are the challenges and opportunities for emerging markets? Well, I mentioned this worry we had right at the beginning, one of our motivations. What about the robots taking all the jobs? The robots are still relatively expensive, even the ones that are coming through now, the more flexible ones, the ones that you can program on the production line. relatively easily. But you're still talking about tens of thousands of dollars typically for those. And they're still not able to do everything. You can plug them into the process, but they can't do everything. And if you compare that to the annual income of somebody in an emerging market in Southeast Asia, a few $1,000s a year, it's going to be a while, I think, before this is a real threat to the lower income countries. It becomes more of an issue for the middle income countries. Think Mexico, China. Those countries where labour costs are obviously more expensive, the robots are actually going to get used more and more in those countries. Good news is it's not a problem for China because the labour force is now coming down. It's more of a threat, I think, to the countries following on behind with rapid population growth, particularly the subcontinent, Africa. They would like to plug into the global supply chain, but there's kind of a race here now between the declining price of robotics and whether they can get plugged in and get developed and find niches and find things to do before that time. And so I think finding jobs for less skilled people in emerging markets is going to be difficult. The effects of the connectivity that we're seeing means that for the more skilled people, they're getting plugged in. I mean, a lot of companies now are using programmers from all over the world, which is obviously very easy to do. But all kinds of things, there's all kinds of ways now of connecting people from other parts of the world through the internet, through mobile. We'll talk more about those in a moment. It's the less skilled people that I think that would have been going into factories in China just doing simple assembly work. Eventually, those jobs are at risk. But I would emphasize again that the connectivity is still improving. The telepresence, the virtual reality, simply the improvement in broadband speeds. This is going to make running these extended global supply chains easier and easier as we go forward. So, the opportunities, I guess I've already started on these, the services, and this is one of the changes we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years, the massive growth of the service sector in India, in the Philippines, some other places. This, I think, is becoming larger and is an engine of growth. There's a big debate in the literature as to how effective this can be, but I actually think it is important and will be more important. Another area is the improvements in health and education that digital technology can bring to emerging markets. If you think in terms of health, there's artificial intelligence systems I was talking about. So if you can get that connected to a rural area, then the nurse can actually access that and get much more reliable data and information. So that's important. And then education, already people have access to the MOOCs, the massive open online courses. The next stage of that is to develop the interactive educational techniques, and that's coming as well. But even those MOOCs are actually terribly important for many people in emerging markets who couldn't otherwise access those lectures. And then one of the interesting developments in many emerging markets is attempting to use the technology to improve law and order and also transparency. So in many countries now you can notify about corruption just by going onto a website and notifying about it. A lot of countries are trying to use mobile payments and other developments as a way to pay people direct so that you can cut out the middleman in welfare systems. As you know, one of the huge problems in many emerging markets is you try to help poor people by supplying cheap food or cheap energy, and it all gets incredibly corrupt and most of the money goes to better off people. So these are, I think, very important things too. So, just to conclude, we think that digital technology, this third wave, is set for new leaps forward. It is changing the world, and generally in a good way. Companies are excited and nervous, and I think Standard Chartered, like many companies, we have an outpost now in San Francisco. A group of people whose sole job is to check out what's happening, find the new ideas early and quickly, filter them, and also to organize what I would call technology tours. So they take our chief executives around to see companies. Every 6 months they do this now, and the big companies and the startups. And the idea is to really be aware of what's available, aware of what's coming early. And in most companies now, I would say the chief information officer is as important as the chief financial officer. Is getting to that point now. So it could boost investment, as I've said. It should boost productivity. And I would come back to one theme we emphasize throughout, I know Stephen's very keen on, which is that adoption is more important than invention. I think for emerging markets, one of the worst mistakes they can make is to say, right, we need to get our own technology industry. So we're going to have local content regulations, we're going to try to spend a lot of money to set something up. But it's changing so quickly. And a lot of companies in the US and Europe now are not trying to hang on to technology, they're sharing it with the kind of open innovation model. So I think for emerging markets to try to do that is a mistake. What really matters is not whether you've invented the iPad, but whether you've got an iPad on everybody's desk. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, John, that's great. Thank you. I think I agree with just about everything in your presentation, although we perhaps have disproven the utility of Skype this morning because our efforts to get Chris Bean online from Singapore have regrettably met without success this morning. So, but that's okay. It'll give us more time for a Q&A with the audience afterwards. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Rod for your remarks, if you don't mind.
You want to go here?
Wherever you prefer.
If you don't mind, I'll just stay right here. Well, thanks for inviting me to this thing. This gave me an opportunity to read this report. I mean, we in the office of the chief economist make use of Standard Chartered's work on macro, sort of short-term work on macro all the time. This was the first time I've had an opportunity to read one of the longer-term thematic reports, and I'm happy to report that there's some really good stuff in there, and I highly recommend it to everybody here in the audience. So thank you for doing this report. There's a few points that I just want to emphasize that resonate with us at the State Department. We come at this from a policy standpoint, and so I'll try to highlight some of the policy issues that this report brings up. The first one, and this may seem completely obvious to a group of technophiles such as yourselves, but the first point that I just think is really important here is to emphasize technology and technology adoption as a growth issue. I've met with countless foreign governments, and usually because of my position as chief economist, I'm talking with finance ministers or economy ministers or central bankers. There's a period of time in which we discuss the monetary and fiscal policy. We talk about sort of macro aggregates. We talk about what's going on in terms of structural reform, and then we get to the question of, well, all right, what about long-term growth? And that's where, at least in developed countries, everybody is kind of crestfallen of, well, our productivity isn't very high, our labor force growth is projected to be at 1% or 5.5% or minus 1%, as the case may be. What are you going to do? What are you going to do in terms of promoting long-term growth? And the usual solutions are, well, we need to build more roads, we need to build more ports, we need to invest in education. And all of those things are good things, but it's rare that the first thing on their mind is we need to adopt new technology, and that's surprising to me. I guess probably not surprising to you, but it's certainly always surprising to me. And so one of the things that I think a report like this and others like it can do is just really put hammer home the idea that, look, your growth, your future, avoiding secular stagnation is really all about these types of technologies. So I commend the authors for just highlighting that point. And I would also point out that another feature of governments that I run into all the time is how incredibly fragmented they are in terms of their technology policies. So it's never the finance ministry that is in charge of technology policy, right? So I say, this is a big important growth issue. This should be on your radar screen. And they say, yes, you're right. But internet, that's handled by the Ministry of Information, or this this or that technology is handled by this or that ministry. I was in Latvia recently, and I noticed on my schedule that I was going to go visit the Ministry of Transportation. I said, why am I going to talk to the Ministry of Transportation? Well, it turns out those are the guys in charge of the internet. Okay? So I go to the Ministry of Transportation and I sit down with them and I say, okay, let's talk about internet openness. Let's talk about some policy issues. And oh, no, we don't do internet policy here. We build the wires. We put the wires in, but the internet policy, that's handled by a different ministry altogether. And so in many countries, nobody really knows who's in charge of technology policy. So coordinating a technology strategy for a country is surprisingly difficult. I know it's kind of perhaps trivial to say, or a bit odd to say, well, okay, the solution to your technology problems is to reorganize your ministries, but it's actually true. In many countries, they just don't have their act together on this, and so highlighting this issue is extremely important. Second point I would make, and this is a bit of a criticism, I guess, is that all of the technologies that we're talking about, or at least most of the big game technologies that we're talking about, depend upon connectivity. Okay, so one of the 3 C's mentioned in the report is connectivity. Well, that presumes that what's available is a fast, affordable, widespread internet, but also one that is free, open, and interoperable. And that is, I think, something that we cannot just presume. It's something that perhaps we take for granted, being in a country where that's largely true. But in many countries, that's not true at all. In many countries, there's a huge urban-rural divide, just in terms of the availability of this technology. But also, there are major efforts afoot in many countries to actually put restrictions on the internet for policy reasons. That is, wall off the internet, restrict cross-border data flows, attempt to install government regulators at the global level for the purpose of governing the internet. And there are various reasons that countries do this. In many cases, it's because they're, one of the features of the internet and an open internet is that it facilitates things like grassroots political movements, which aren't universally popular throughout the world. But it's an extremely important area of policy. I know that ITIF does a lot of work on this and emphasizes this point as well. And I think that that's a point that needs that cannot be overemphasized. We should not take for granted that connectivity is going to be there in the future when governments are actually interested in walling off the internet. And we at the State Department, of course, take this issue very seriously. We've been working very hard to promote the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance at the global level, but also to try and include in, for example, trade agreements, principles of free and open flow of data across borders, and through other aspects of our trade agreements, like bringing down barriers to ITC goods, bringing down barriers to ITC-enabled services, protection of intellectual property. There's an entire range of technology-friendly policies that we try and build in our trade agreements, and largely this is in an effort to create an international environment in which connectivity can be promoted and preserved. So. But again, this is studies like this one help us, right? Because we can go to countries and say, look, we want these things in our trade agreements, or we want this or that type of internet governance, and the reason you should care about this is because it's a growth issue. So I applaud you in that. Another point that I would also commend the report on is the emphasis on adoption being more important than innovation. You touched on that in your comments, and I think that point is actually spot on. Many countries view innovation as the goal, and when that becomes the sole goal, it's very easy for them to see this as a zero-sum game. Either we win or we lose. And What this does is result in a lot of very bad policies. Policies that in many cases run counter to the objective of adoption, right? So data localization, local content requirements, forced technology transfer, all of these policies that we see various countries choosing, we know why they're doing it, right? We know that they're doing it to, sometimes in the name of privacy, but most often in the name of promoting a national champion. But what it does is it actually it comes at the expense of adoption, and adoption is really a key to growth for most countries, particularly countries that are emerging that are currently not quite up to the technology frontier. So that's an extremely important point as well. And finally, I would also say that the connection between adoption and development is an extremely important and extremely hopeful message, because when you talk about countries that are way behind and that don't even have plans for promoting innovation, to be able to say, look, adoption is a key growth or a key development strategy is extremely important. And here I want to just give a shout out to USAID and their US Global Development Lab, which is designed precisely to do this kind of thing, to try and use or to try and promote adoption of new technologies for the specific purpose of reducing extreme poverty. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I probably went over, but I guess we have a little extra time thanks to Skype.
Well, that's great, Rod. Thank you so much. Clark.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today and to share what has been our experience from an emerging economy perspective on how we see technology playing a critical role in development. And the first thing that I want to say, I want to take a couple of minutes because John was mentioning right before we started that he had been to Colombia 25 years ago, and let me tell you that a lot of things have happened in that time frame. And for those of you that have not been able to visit Colombia lately or read about, are you listening? Yeah. Okay, yes, we are. So thank you. So for those of you that haven't been able to visit or read about our country lately, I'm glad to share with you that today we have a totally different country. It took a lot of effort from our citizens in terms of their lives, economic contributions, also the support from the US and the international community. But through those efforts, we were able to restore security and stability in our country. And we are creating a modern economy. We have a friendly agreement with our colleagues from Argentina, but we can certainly say that today we are the third largest economy in South America. We have a GDP of $400 billion. Our income per capita has grown from less than $2,000 in the early 2000s to more than $8,000 last year. And things like investment have flown to Colombia, key for development. We have investment rates of over 30% of GDP. And last year alone, we received $15 billion in foreign direct investment. So this is a totally different country. And as part of that transformation, our government has identified that technology can play a critical role. Not only, you mentioned something that perhaps it could fuel inequalities. We see technology as a tool for major social change and to close that gap. Back in 2010, our government launched this plan called Live Digital. Its objective was to massify internet throughout our country and create a digital ecosystem in Colombia. So we had to begin from the basic. We had to make sure that we had the infrastructure and the services. This required a lot of investment from our government, capital investment to deploy the infrastructure, to be able to provide a lower price of the services, like something that you discussed also in the report, the challenges of having usefulness and price, implications and in terms of the adaptation of technology. So we needed to overcome those challenges as well as an emerging economy. And through that effort, we've been able to create, foster also the development of applications and encourage users to appropriate technology and apply it in a day-to-day life. So we see, going back to your comment of it's important to have that everyone has an iPad. We don't want to develop the next iPad. Of course, we want that everyone has the iPad, but more important than that, we believe that we need that the iPad has applications that people can relate to and that they see the value in those. Like, for example, we have challenges of content in terms of Spanish based applications. So we are focusing a lot of our efforts in developing services that are really valued by Colombians. As part of that investment, we've been able to connect. We went from less than 200 municipalities of 1,100 that we have in Colombia to 1,078 last year. We almost completely connected our country to fiber optic network. That's a massive investment that we've done. In terms of household connectivity, we have almost 50%. 9 million families in Colombia that have broadband connectivity now, and what we are trying to do is, from a government perspective, is to identify in all those different area of policies, of public policies, where we can create or foster that ecosystem. So, for example, in terms of our tax policy, we eliminated taxes and import duties on computers and tablets and electronics. So that's a major part. Even housing policy, we have a major program where we are providing lower income families with affordable homes and subsidized homes, and we are making sure that whenever we provide one of those homes, there is also a subsidy for internet services. So it's a matter of identifying all the different areas of our public policy, and that's done by our Ministry of Information and Communications Technology, finding those opportunities to incentive the development of that ecosystem. So we believe that technology can certainly play a role, even though it perhaps is not easily reflected on GDP, like John mentioned. It really can have an impact in the day-to-day lives of people, in the opportunities that they have in order to connect to the world, to export their services, etc. It's a challenge. It requires a lot of public-private partnerships as well. So things like we are working with our operators, mobile operators. In our previous 4G spectrum bid, they had in addition to the economic contribution they had to do to purchase the spectrum, they had to commit to a certain number of tablets and computers to be able to send those to public schools in Colombia. So we are trying to maximize opportunities to create that ecosystem, to train public school teachers. We have trained over 60,000 teachers, and bringing technology to areas that were unthinkable. So we have now deployed 7,000, we call them kiosks. They are internet community centers. Sometimes, most of them are located in schools where, the students can use them, but after they are done with their activities, they are also offered to the community, and they could visit and, use a computer, get online, and receive training for how to look for things. We have to create the basic capabilities as well. So I think we are at a point where we have been able to create the basic ecosystem, the infrastructure. We have beginning to work in application development. We have a community of users that are understanding the opportunities that technology can bring to their lives. And now what the next step that we want to take is to become a major hub for the development of applications for the base of the pyramid. So what we are trying to do is to partner with companies like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, so they can use Colombia and that connectivity that we have already been able to create to test and develop applications for those almost, I think, 4,000 million people that are in the lower levels of the income chain throughout the world. So last month we had Mark Zuckerberg in Colombia, and he launched the Internetorg initiative in our country. We were the first country in the Western Hemisphere where they are implementing that. And through that partnership between the government, Facebook, and local mobile carriers, almost 2 million Colombians are getting internet, like 14 different applications without having to purchase a data plan. So they can, and it's not only logging into Facebook, it's more than that. It's like connecting to the state. They are, they can consult our public sector job listing service through that. They can see programs for improvement of health in women, things like weather, etc. So I think it's a powerful tool, and that's how we see it. And I think in terms of that part of the report, when you talk about it could be a challenge for inequality, we see it more as an opportunity and a tool to really contribute to that transformation of our country.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, John, let me ask you if you'd like to respond to any of the comments or remarks that the panelists have made.
I think I agree with everything that's been said there, so I'd really like to hear from the audience. But maybe I could just take the quick opportunity to say that we have the executive summary is available on the desk out there, that pamphlet. If anybody wants a copy of the full report, it is available at standardchartered.com, or if you give me your card, I'd be happy to send you a PDF.
Well, I'm happy to open it to the audience for questions, so if there are any out there, I'll take them in the order I see them. If you would just please, when I call upon you, state your name and the organization you're with, that'd be great. And I think I saw it over here first. Macaulay, Melissa will bring you a microphone.
Thank you. I'm Lex Riefel with the Brookings Institution. There's some demographic aspects of this topic that you haven't gone into very far, John, and I was wondering if you could, how much you've thought about these, and if you could tell us a little about them. For example, impact on population growth. I mean, is the technology, this wave of technology, going to contribute to, going to help see more population growth, more rapid population growth, or is it going to, I mean, there's sort of a secular trend towards slower population growth, and maybe this will accelerate trend to a slower population growth. How about the impact on single income families? I mean, maybe some of the pressure to have sort of double income families will come off. How about a shorter work week? What is the impact on urban youth unemployment, which is going to be one of the big challenges, I think, of the next 30, 40, 50 years? And then finally, so we have this trend to sort of customize the sort of local craft movement, and is there going to be sort of more, less mass production and more customized production because of this?
So lots of interesting questions there. On population growth, I haven't thought about that. I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the success of internet dating. Maybe that's contributing to more marriages. I don't know whether that brings more children. Yeah, that'd be an interesting one to think about. I haven't got much more to say about that. The single income family, I mean, one of the reasons I think why inequality appears to have increased is we're seeing more double income families, and you tend to get quite often two high income people together that therefore show up as a very high household income, and that's definitely one of the factors. Could technology change this? I think one of the big changes is the ability to work from home now, which is certainly making it easier for women to work, actually, and probably makes it more likely you have double income families. So I'm not sure how those things would play out. Shorter work week, again, I don't see that. My own experience is the work week seems to get longer and longer because you're potentially connected all the time. Working for an Asian-oriented bank, my evenings are pretty busy, my afternoons are quieter, and then my mornings are busy. So I'm not sure you necessarily see a shorter work week as a result. And I think the way that if you have the skills, you can leverage the computers to really be very effective, means that there's more pressure, if you like, from employers to really get people to work longer. So that may be one of the problems. Having said that, you have the other trend, for example, the way that Uber works. You talk to Uber drivers, and many of them are actually being pretty flexible, working part-time, maybe just hitting the rush hours and playing around a golf in the afternoon. So maybe that is also another lifestyle choice that it makes it possible. But customization, I think, was something we have thought about, and I think this is particularly 3D printing. I think this is going to make a huge difference, and I think we're going to see customization across a wide range of things in developed countries, and it's already going that way. I mean, recently we remodeled our kitchen, and I was astonished at how many different warehouses my wife took me to look at different tiles. I mean, you'd think you could just go to one and see 1,000 different tiles and choose them, but no, we had to go to lots of different ones and find a kind of boutique place. And so there's enormous demand for that, and I think the 3D printing is going to make that possible to a much greater degree. So in future, you won't pick out the door handles, you'll design your own door handle and get it printed, and you'll have a unique door handle. So this kind of thing, I think, is going to be very, very important in future.
I think I saw here, next.
I'd like to thank the panel. It's a great presentation this morning. I know Standard Chartered did a great job, at least from the executive summary. My question, and I am Peter Moons. I am a Department of Defense detailee at the Department of State at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. So looking at crisis before they become epic. And so my question pertains perhaps to all three panelists, and this is about the bottom billion. I'm sure you're aware of the book and the subject of the same name. So how do you think that the increase in technology, connectivity, adoption, and innovation will perhaps create a more bifurcated society at a micro level in each country, particularly as the low-skilled are replaced or supplanted by robotics or increases in genetics or other technologies, and thus creating more wealth disparity, a higher income, and that, particularly, let's say, as a short anecdote, Colombia has a Gini index of 0.8, relatively high. Also has a lack of road connectivity in about 40% of the country, as you mentioned, your country's ecosystem. And then, Dr. Ludema, you mentioned the factor of social movements. So, as wealth disparity increases, potential for social movements also increases. I just wonder if you could address that.
I'll go first, maybe you have something. I think in terms of the bottom billion, the answer has to be economic development that will spread out. I mean, that's what we see. We don't have that same problem in the developed countries because we've developed. So a lot of it's got to be, we've got to get emerging countries developed. And I do see the new technologies as helping with that in general, by creating the connectivity that can then allow them to plug into the global supply chain and develop. Now, initially, these technologies are not going to reach the bottom billion directly. So it's going to be spreading out from the cities and eventually creating more jobs, more opportunities for people. Many of the bottom billion are living in rural villages still, doing very basic farming. And that's got to change, as it has changed in the developed countries. So I see it very much in terms of opportunities for development, really.
And pages 68 to 73 of his report do a great job of talking to that point exactly. Rob.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I guess I would concur with that. I think that the bottom billion, it's difficult to imagine that these technologies are going to put a whole lot of additional pressure on them that they're not already experiencing, and that if anything, these technologies are going to provide them a way out. Now, it may be that they're sort of the current, if you will, working class doing various jobs that we currently take they're currently what we call low skilled, that they may feel greater pressure. I guess that's not the bottom billion that I think of, right? But that's sort of the perhaps the bottom half of the U.S. income distribution, for example. I think that's where the concerns. We've already seen widening income distribution between the rich and the poor in the U.S. And it's an open question as to whether or not that will continue with these new technologies. But I think in terms of the absolute, the bottom billion, I don't see the dynamics quite as stark as that.
And I think that's where public policy can play a big role. You have to make sure that, or in our case, what we are trying to do is to focus the investments in those 1 billion. That the problem of the base of the pyramid. So in terms of bringing the computers to schools, we are focusing on those rural areas that don't have have technology, and those kids that their parents couldn't afford even a tablet or a smartphone. So our aim is to be able to make sure that every school has, at least they have one computer or tablet per 12 children. So we're focusing on those segments of the population, but that's one part that public policy can intervene in order to avoid the widening inequality as a result of the expansion of digital technologies. But also, I think the other element that it's important to highlight is that this is also a tool to respond to the needs to those people as well. So things like as they have been able to go from the lower and the poorest levels to the middle class, they require more services from the state. So education, they want to have better education, they want to have health services that are adequate for their needs. So for example, in Colombia, sometimes it's impossible to guarantee that we have specialists in smaller rural towns. So through telemedicine, we are able to provide, specialty services or consultations to towns that it wouldn't be possible. They would have to travel hours in order to be able to see any neurosurgeon or anything like that. So I think it's a tool as well, and also in terms of health, education policy as well, and also interacting with the state. I think that's another. Most of the processes we are working to provide an opportunity for citizens to do things online, so pay taxes and find ask for certain certificates from the state. You can do that online and you get it via email. That's also another way of actually responding to that.
We at ITIF did a report called Digital Drag that looked at the level of taxes and tariffs on ICT products in countries. We found that countries like Bangladesh, which have the highest taxes and tariffs on ICT products, actually decrease adoption and usage of ICT technologies in their society by 25 to 40%, precluding the types of quality of life the improvements you get. So congrats to Colombia for being a member of ITA expansion negotiations and lowering their tariffs on ICT products. That's great. Okay, let's go to the gentleman with the glasses there.
Thanks. Thank you. My name is Hart Schwartz. I work at Clarify Consulting. My question is whether GDP is the right way to capture the productivity gains, because the problem with it is that if the cost reductions are so dramatic, the way that GDP is constructed, every cost is also equal to income, because income is, if one person's expenditure is another person's income. So it's like if you have a doctor who does a bad procedure, it has to be redone. You have twice, the second person gets paid too, so GDP goes up. So maybe these technologies are so good that they're not capturing the cost reduction in GDP.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, we looked at this and sort of scratched our heads over it. I mean, the trouble as economists, you kind of have to use the data, but you're absolutely right. I think one needs to have the perspective that you're really not measuring it particularly well. The general purpose technology changes everything. and in the actual technology itself, it's quite hard to measure what kind of productivity you're gaining from that, because it's happening so quickly and so much, and often it's doing something you couldn't do before. And one of the examples with the railway, for example, is that if you try to calculate how that just lowers the cost of going across the country, so you can maybe get across the country in 24 hours instead of, I don't know, 3 months, that's one measure. But the fact that you can then transport perishable goods much more effectively in bulk, it's really, really hard to sort of measure that. And I think in the actual use of the technology, perhaps it's easier there. So to the extent that, for example, Walmart is able to make its inventory process much better and bring prices down as a result, that probably does get measured. So I think we're measuring some parts and not other parts. I also think that with digital technology, we're probably, because of its nature, the fact that it's zero cost basically, as you said, so you're not capturing a lot of income in there, I think it probably means that productivity in reality is much higher than we think. I would caution though, and Robert Gordon would argue that this was to some extent true of other technologies as well. So we have to be a bit cautious about how much we make of that. But I do think it's an extreme case, that the fact that copying cost is zero. So I think probably digital technology is different to other ones.
Linda Schmidt, Trade and Services International. I had a question about investment. You talked a little bit about investment, and I think this is from a U.S. perspective. You were talking about the shortcomings of public policy in foreign countries. We have some shortcomings of public policy in our own country, and I think one of the challenges we have is a lack of public investment. You also have Ms. Fernandez from Colombia, and it sounds to me like what is happening in Colombia is a lot of public investment in infrastructure. And I wonder if the panel can talk a little bit about the U.S. lag in broadband speeds when compared to other countries like Korea, and how our system of infrastructure investment is is influencing that, because I think there's an extreme gap in the United States. I don't think there's sufficient public investment, and I don't think we should necessarily have to rely on Google to go to a couple of cities to, bring broadband speeds up to snuff. So if you could talk a little bit about the U.S. market and how we can position ourselves to compete internationally in the world economy.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it relates to also what's the best way to do things. Should the government really be taking a big lead on things, or should the private sector find its way to it? And in some countries where broadband speeds are very high, the government has made that a huge priority, which is probably the right thing to do, but often those governments also make all kinds of other things a big priority and probably distort resource allocation. So it's a tricky one to judge, I think. I think it does make a difference, though. I'm interested in Rodney's view on this, but broadband speed is so critical for many of the things we're looking at with the new technologies, the ability to do that. And the reason Skype fails so often is because actually the broadband speeds aren't good enough. So then you have to go to a specialist video conferencing facility, which is much more expensive, and people don't use it so much. So the ability to make it just ubiquitous, I think, is going to be really important going forward.
Rod, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, again, I don't have that much to add other than I think that the economic case for public investment in internet is unassailable. There's huge externalities associated with it, both domestically as well as internationally, and so public investment is certainly warranted. The reason it doesn't happen is mainly politics, but I'll stop at that point.
I just add that to that. ITIF produced a report last year, I believe, Rob, that ranked countries' quality, price, and affordability of broadband. U.S. is right up near the top of that. I know people talk about South Korea and try and say, well, the broadband's faster in South Korea. It's slightly different when you're dealing with very high concentration, large buildings. Whereas we live in a suburban environment, and when you look at the quality of the speed in this different type of topography, we have definitely close to the world's best broadband. Also, we should be able to prioritize packets so we can do our Skype video conferencing faster. So anyway, okay, let's go to the back.
Yeah, my name is Bill Koblacher from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, but the former Science Technology Advisor at the State Department. A quick comment and then a question. I certainly agree that technology adoption is very important, but I don't believe there's any conflict with countries that are trying to improve their innovative capacity. I think the two things are complementary and work very well together, and growth policy needs to include both technology adoption, public policies, as well as those that increase the innovative capacity of a country. But my question is that the UN right now with countries are developing sustainable development goals to replace Millennium Development Goals, the kind of issues that have been talked about today, and I thought the Standard Charter report was great and the comments were very good. But these kind of issues are not really a very big part of what's being discussed in Sustainable Development Goals. Do you think they should be?
Okay, just on the first point, I mean, I think I agree with you, providing that the innovative policies are the right ones. So they are trying to create things, doing the infrastructure, trying to open things up, not the restrictive type that we talked about earlier. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, yeah, it's a good point. I understand that whole debate is quite bogged down at the moment. I think there's dozens and dozens of potential goals that people are putting forward, and the problem is to actually filter them down into a smaller number that are actually doable and manageable and measurable. But yeah, I mean, I think you probably should be putting something like broadband on there as part of sustainable development. We talk about this issue a little bit in the report. Obviously, there are issues around the new technologies that might be negative for sustainability, looked at from the sort of green perspective, if you like, because we're talking about technology which uses electricity. Now, it doesn't use as much as you might think, all these machines, but they do use electricity, and that's resource use, so that's potentially a negative. It does encourage extended supply chains, which again, from the green sustainability point of view, is sometimes considered a negative thing. On the plus side, it can actually raise efficiency, get new technologies that make it more easier to use renewable energies and such like. So you've got that. I think it comes back, though, if you're thinking about goals like reaching that bottom billion, which I think was what the Millennium Development Goals are really about. I mean, I think the new technologies definitely can help with that, as we discussed.
Let's go up front.
I'm Bob Hershey, I'm a consultant. To what extent do the new technologies, especially internet, help in having meetings online and getting together funding for community projects online and making things work with more transparency?
Definitely they can, and I think they are. You see that across all kinds of activities. I mean, within business, it's possible. When even a report like this, this was put together with myself sitting in Toronto, my boss in Singapore, my staff mostly in London, but with teams from our on-the-ground economists from around the world, putting in some country studies at the end of the report. The desktop publishing was done in Chennai. The editing was done in New York. So the possibility to have these kind of collaborative arrangements, is huge. And this applies within business, but also within the community as well. So, and there's all kinds of exciting things around crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, new ways of lending, for example, in the financial industry. We're still exploring all these possibilities. People are still getting used to the ideas. The technology, as we saw today, doesn't always work perfectly. It's all coming, and it's all very exciting. And I'm very excited about it, partly because, especially when you look at emerging markets, it really is only in the cities that they have this stuff so far. And even there, the broadband speeds are often a lot lower than we would be used to. So it's all going to spread. It's all going to become much, much more significant over the next few years.
Robert, I read the other day that these crowdsourced capital funding, like Kickstarter or Kiva, are operating in 80 countries now. So completely transform access to capital in a lot of these developing countries. Oh, yeah, Pilar, yes.
I just wanted to add that it can also transform the relationship among governments. So, for example, what in this time of fiscal constraints, we have, part of the work that we do in the embassy is to design collaboration programs with the U.S. Government agencies. And of course, having experts travel to our countries requires a lot of investment. And what we've done in the past is schedule a series of technical video conferences, for example, and we bring experts, things like we are trying to understand how to improve energy efficiency in Colombia. So last week we had all the big experts from Department of Energy and related agencies meeting with the team in Colombia, with the private sector, the government agencies, and sharing the best practices. So it's an important tool as well to better engage with other governments in these times where resources are limited and time it's very valuable. So it's another opportunity here.
I'm sorry. Hi, my name is Sarah Davidson, and I'm with the Korean Economic Institute. As an undergraduate, I worked in humanoid robotics at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, and we can see how obviously robotics and other technology is shaping the skill sets we need to perform successfully in the new work environment. And I was wondering what skill sets you believe are worth investing in. As you can see, the job market as well as necessary skill sets are really changing as technology plays a greater role in our lives. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. We look at that in the report. Robots and artificial intelligence systems are good at certain things. So the robots are good, obviously, at relatively routine things. They're also good at very heavy things or very dangerous things for people to be doing. The artificial intelligence is good at collating data from lots of places and coming up with a conclusion. So what we think of as being the expert or the expert system, for example, this is going to be very, very important. But for things like dealing with people, arranging things, being creative about pulling things together and bringing things from unexpected sources, that type of, if you like, expert knowledge, knowing the right people, those sorts of things. Robots are not going to be doing that so well, at least for some time. And when you think of more middle-skilled jobs, again, it's going to be the things that involve people interaction. And it's going to. These things are going to. Some of the jobs are going to be taken by the robots. If you think of partly by reorganizing the way we do things. I mean, if you think of the driverless car and the whole delivery process, a lot of people are employed currently in delivery of one kind or another. They drive a van or a truck and then they run into a building. So it's going to be very difficult to have a robot that drives the car and then runs into the building. That's we're a long way from that. But maybe the way it's going to work is that the car will just turn up at the curb, send you a cell phone message, you go to the curb, you get it out of the car, whatever the delivery is. So there are ways to do that, and often it's about reconfiguring things. That's not going to happen within 3 to 5 years. That's 15 to 30 years, I would say. But it's going to mean that what the kind of skills people are going to need is going to be particularly people skills, particularly creative skills, particularly innovation skills. I think customization, think of that and how that would work in the service sector. We're going to see fast food restaurants, I think, go quite automatic. They're already going that way. You go in and you order with a machine. Maybe gets delivered by a machine, made by a machine. So it's going to be the customization that you get in a higher class restaurant that is going to be so important going forward. So individuality. This is a big issue out in Asia, where we look at the education system in the US or UK, my country, and we sort of despair sometimes that some people can't read and write. And then we look at Singapore and we say, wow, they're so good on the maths and the engineering and stuff. But they're terrified that they're not creative enough, that they don't have the individuality that the US system, the UK system produces. And I think in the long run, actually, the Western system is going to work better on that. But that may be the thing that needs to be kind of scheduled into schools and really emphasized more than building up the knowledge, because the knowledge is going to be at the tip of your fingers, and increasingly it'll be just asking. It'll be a voice recognition system that gives you the information. Jim.
Thank you. I'm Jim Burke from Task. Given that adoption is more important than innovation, how do you see intellectual property rights and laws and the way that's written into agreements changing, if any, over the years?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I haven't looked at this in great detail. It's clearly very important in the sense that, especially in terms of the global supply chain, companies are not willing to place elements of the production process where there is important intellectual property in a country where it isn't protected to a degree. Having said that, even if you have protections, the reality is in many countries there's ways to get around that. And I think a lot of companies are now taking the view that the way you stay ahead is not by getting a piece of brilliant, whatever it is, software idea or whatever, and holding onto it or trying to license it. That's going to increasingly be tough. The way you do it is to just be ahead all the time. You just got to keep innovating. And often sharing what you're doing may be important, because that way you bring more people into it and make it a more general technology. So I think it's important. I think the way it's developing and emerging is actually going to probably be a bit different from the old model.
And we got time for one more. Let's go in the back.
Fine. Michaela Weber, I'm from the World Bank. Where do you see the World Bank fitting in? And just an add-on. I mean, we are all very educated people, and you say knowledge is at a fingerprint there, but why are we not succeeding in getting to this bottom of the billion?
That's a big question. I mean, I think a lot of what we talked about today is how important technology is going forward, how it's changing development strategies. We talked about the global supply chain and how technology makes the global supply chain really the route to development. And we think of the way that US developed, or Germany, or Japan, or Korea. They basically created their own whole supply chain, but that's not the way countries are doing it now. China is plugged in as an assembly place. Now they're trying to develop a broader sort of supply chain and a broader economy, sometimes with success, sometimes with not so much success. And arguably, some of the things that are holding them back is trying to do everything themselves. And maybe they should be more content with staying with just the supply chain. For most other countries, they simply don't have the scale anyway to do that. But I think if the World Bank is thinking about development strategies, I think you've got to think about how do you plug into the supply chain, what's the best way to do it, and also, as we've discussed, the critical role of technology in enabling that and making it possible to do that. I don't know whether
Paula, Rodney, do you want to jump in on that one, or offer any last word?
I think also you can have the wide vision of what have been some successful policies throughout the world. So for our perspective, institutions like the World Bank can certainly play a critical role identifying those success cases and helping countries draw the lessons from other areas of the world to apply in their own context. So I think that advisory role is critical as well in this process.
Well, that's great. Listen, I think this has been a very lively and entertaining discussion with some great questions from the audience. Please thank John and our respondents.